music line, Al called this panel "Return to Lender." We know you don't really return helicopters to lenders other than the worst circumstances. Anybody know what song he was riffing when he created that title? Return to Sender, right, Elvis Presley, there you go. But so I just didn't want there to be confusion about this. This is really going to be focused on returning leased helicopters and, some circumstances where lenders are involved, but that's really the crux of it. So Eddie Gross, shareholder of Vedder Price, started the DC office 15 years ago. I do this stuff. It's fun to me. Characters, right, in this industry. My pals sitting on my right, each is going to introduce themselves.
Good morning, I'm Kieran Hannan. I'm SVP of Technical Operations for Milestone Aviation.
I'm Terri Foley. I'm the General Counsel of LCI, based in Dublin, and been there for about 12 years.
I'm Todd Wolynski. I'm a partner at White & Case, based in New York.
Zohar Zik, partner at HFW, based in London.
Or as I refer to them, lawyer, real person.
I think this is the most expensive panel we've had today.
Good point. All right, so very good. So we have a couple of main questions to ask, and each of them comes from a different perspective, and hopefully it's useful, and you'll ask questions if you have follow-up. So what's at stake for lessors, lenders, when a helicopter is returned or recovered? So, Terri, you start. From an operating lessor's point of view, what is it that you focus on most?
The way I look at this, I think from an operating lessor perspective, you're obviously looking at the residual value of the asset. You want to make sure that's maintained at the end. You've also got the income stream from the asset. You want to minimize downtime so that the aircraft continues to earn income. But against that, you've also got to then balance and value the relationship between, but not just the outgoing lessee, but also the incoming lessee. So we need to protect those relationships, and we need to value those relationships, because if we just focus purely on residual value and income, that isn't necessarily what the lessee is going to be interested in. And we want to make sure that by protecting the relationships with our lessees, that they're there to hopefully lease more aircraft from us. And so it's a complex sort of balance, but if you can maintain all three and value all three, then at the end of that, you should have a successful lease transition.
Kieran, when you get involved in circumstances with your customers and you're considering their compliance or almost compliance with the return requirements, are you concerned about changing industry practices, right? So if you were more lenient as it relates to a certain aspect of the return requirements, is that of concern for you, or is the relationship with the customer more important, right? So rigid line versus customer flexibility.
I think it's a bit of a mix of both, frankly. I think Terri hit the key part on her answer there, that at the end of the day, we're trying to make sure that the asset is a viable asset on a through-life basis, but individually on a lease-by-lease basis, then we're having to make sure that we can transition the aircraft effectively from one lessee to another. Obviously, what's in the contract is key in terms of maintaining that value and making sure that the assets return to us in the condition that's required. But I think you really need to develop that on a true sort of partnership basis also. So, we're invested in the space for a long term. We're dealing with the same operators. We want to make sure that we're creating partnerships as we go through not only that singular asset, but also through the portfolio that we have with a particular operator. So it's a bit of a mix of both.
Terrific. One of the things that I'm most useful to is finance leasing. So my lawyer friends at the end, your perspective, if you're representing a finance lessor, what's their biggest concern upon return? Is it the same? Is it different? How would you suggest that they might view it differently? Let's just say. Let's assume that it's different.
I think we chatted when we prepared. You explained how the U.S. financiers look at it. That you have a hybrid structure where a financier would finance on the basis of a possible return. This is less common in this part of the world, where a financier will look at full payout structure. So their concern would be the viability of the lessee, the creditworthiness of the lessee. They will look less at the return condition as such. I think that in your side of the pond, there is a real risk where financiers who are primarily bankers looking at an asset, not really understanding the asset, they're taking real asset risk and then don't have the ability or the in-house resources to truly manage the return, if there is one, whether it's forced or at the end of the lease, and to be able to maximize the lease, the helicopter value going forward.
Right, how they view the opportunity to provide this lease financing, right? They're looking at their ultimate yield, and they'll take tax benefits under U.S. laws. That's one way that they recover their investment. Another is, of course, end of term. Todd, what would you say?
You know, I agree. I think we talked about this earlier, all of us, about the difference between a lender versus a lessor and how they view it. And it goes to Terry's point about the relationship where, you know, a lessor is not only invested in an asset, although should be the guiding principle and paramount, but it's also this relationship to continue the churn with the lessees and to get the asset working together. And there could be that conflict in certain circumstances. You know, when you have a challenging market condition or otherwise, and you're getting an asset back, and you know, how strict are you with the return conditions? And I think ultimately you can prevent that, and we discussed this earlier, by having robust policies and procedures internally, proper communication with the lessee. And I think as the industry matures more, ensuring that there's more structured, I guess, not formal guidelines, but informal procedures that all lessees and lessors are more or less operating on the same page.
And right, so it's very significant difference between most of the finance lessors that I've had dealings with and operating lessors. Financing lessors are banks for the most part, right? They're opportunities to invest. They don't differentiate a whole lot between financing cranes and helicopters. So it makes it more challenging for them. They know what they're doing. Banks are very good at credit, though, and so often in deals done in the States, there's a much greater credit focus. All right, so let's go on to the next one. What are the main pain points relating to return? Anybody want to start? Or I'll give you a choice. How about that? All right. So most painful aspects of like a voluntary return, right? Would it be market circumstances at the time, impractical dock requirements, imprecise dock requirements, lessee strategic non-compliance, or surprises, or anything else?
Yeah, I think all the above. I think the biggest thing that at least I found during my time at Waypoint was the lack of communication between the team that you've negotiated the documents with and the actual team that is implementing the documents. You know, you have individuals on the floor touching the metal who don't really understand the return conditions, how much time they need, how much money they need to invest, et cetera, to comply. And I think that could be avoided, going back to sound principles, and Kieran can speak to this, proper communication and making sure that you're communicating with the right people. So if you have a return coming back, you know, next month, you shouldn't show up a month later saying, give me the asset back. You should have been in a long-standing dialogue as part of the monitoring of that asset to ensure that as you approach that expiry date, if it's not being extended, that you are having that transition time be as painless and quick as possible.
No, totally agree, Todd. And we talked extensively about this point this morning. I think, you know, planning is really the key to success in this process. So we've spent a lot of time developing the internal technical competency to develop that from almost as soon as the aircraft goes on lease, essentially, you start planning for the
redelivery. Chronological line.
So I was explaining this morning that sort of in the fixed wing space, you know, the lease terms tend to be longer, so they've got more time to plan out. On our side, we sort of normally start our planning process around 12, 13 months out, which is what you need to do in order to successfully redeliver the aircraft. So we start engaging in sort of sending out the documentation set. We'll allocate key resources internally on the technical side. But also, to your point, Todd, I think the communication is key. So we spend an awful lot of time, focus and effort developing not only the commercial relationship, but the technical relationship also, so that we've got that on a peer-to-peer basis, so that everyone's clear on what the road to success looks like. And, you know, there are some turns in that road, no doubt, that you've got to navigate along the way. But if we do it on a communication basis, then we can make it a successful process.
And the other thing I think is worth adding there is It's not just the back end that we're looking at. It starts on, I was about to say day one, it's actually before day one. It's when you're negotiating the lease documents. I remember when I sort of started, did one of my first leases in the helicopter space, and I thought I negotiated great return conditions until our head of technical looked at them and just said, well, that's not practical, that's not practical, that's not practical. And so we went back and we sat down with our head of technical, the lessee and their technical team, and we worked out what was going to happen in practice. What could the lessee comply with, and then what could we accept? And then when you come to that whole redelivery process, it should, in theory, be smoother because you're reflecting what the actual practical process. Because if you ask for the world and the lessee clearly can't give the world, either because it's going to cost too much or they don't have the time, the capacity, then that's just going to create a lot of headaches and arguments at the beginning of that process. And also if the aircraft is financed, your financier is saying, well, hold on, LCI, why aren't they complying with all these things? So it's really important that before you even get to day one, you are working, exactly as Kieran said, with the technical teams of both sides and getting a fair and reasonable document that can then be delivered and complied with right up to the end.
I would just add, 100% agreed, and we were talking about this earlier, but when I was at Waypoint, Zohar helped me in a lot of the leases in early days, and Dave Gorski, who was our head of technical, worked intimately with Zohar and myself to make sure that the return conditions worked. It wasn't just a bunch of lawyers going into a room and drafting up documents, because that never works, I mean, as much as we like it to. So, I mean, that's key. And I think secondly, the other thing is when you're drafting these return conditions, you're drafting the lease, you're engaging in this great new relationship, you always have to think about the worst. I know people hate that, but you have to think, what happens if we get divorced? What happens if this falls down? And you have to really plot through that and make sure that your return conditions and the conditions in the lease clearly set out what occurs in that circumstance.
Yeah, it's also, you need to remember that this aircraft is going to move on to another lessee, and as we said before, you need to have a communication within the company to ensure that the delivery conditions in the next lease are as close as possible to the redelivery conditions, and to make sure that the transition is smoother in that way. So the communication is circular. You need to keep on talking to each other, and when the commercial people are agreeing the next lease, they are looking at all sorts of options and demands from the next lessee. They need to be aware that helicopters may not be able to easily transition to that lessee. So there need to be communication to ensure that the deal that they are entering into is doable.
I mean, just an observation that I've had based on all the bankruptcies that I've had to deal with over the last couple of years is that one of the biggest issues is that when lawyers draft aircraft leases, fixed wing, helicopters, whatever, they understand the asset. Some of them who have considerable experience understand it fairly well, but they're not going to be as precise as they need to be sometimes, as precise with that kind of advice, right, with technical advice. But then on the other hand, there are many lawyers who will just defer to a technical advisor and not do all the lawyerly things that we do by adding precision regarding some of the non-technical aspects of it. So, for example, if you have certain requirements in your return conditions that say upon return, some say upon expiration, some say upon redelivery, those are three different words that can mean three different things. There was a recent case in the States where a lessor had their opportunity to get damages associated with a bad return was undermined by having those kinds of imprecise words in a lease document. The other thing is,
No, I think at that point, I think it's very important, and when I'm asked by clients what is kind of the most important practical thing they can do, is to always go back to the basic template. What you see again and again is that people take the last deal's document and use it for the next deal. But what you need to do is to use your template document that is being reviewed from time to time to ensure that it is up to date, but not to incorporate changes you made for one lessee that may be jurisdiction specific, lessee specific, whatever that may be, to the next one. So you need to really be very disciplined about that and go back to your sort of zero precedent when you start a new deal. and the same applies to LOI, for example, so that there is a starting point for every negotiation and every drafting process to ensure that, for example, all the defined terms are used consistently in the document. Because sometimes you may use a particular deviated term for a particular lease that said that it's not lease expiry, but on return, which may be at a later date. It may not apply consistently in other leases. So using the base template in every new negotiation is very important.
Another sort of similar concern, and Terry mentioned it before, if you are a lessor and you're thinking, geez, I have the greatest damn return conditions because when I get that helicopter back, it'll be better than new. If you do that, more likely than not, it's going to cost the lessee more to return the aircraft than it will to exercise a purchase option. If your transaction document's governed by New York law, that wouldn't be a lease under U.S. commercial law. That would essentially be a sale because the lessee's compelled to buy. And so under U.S. commercial law, you wouldn't have the tax benefits, there'd be accounting considerations, but most importantly, you would be essentially a lender, not a lessor. You'd have worse remedies in enforcement or bankruptcy. So there are implications also, non-compliance. Right?
So lessor should contract under English law.
No, I think to that.
No, trust me.
Another recommendation.
But so compliance, like what is an appropriate compliance implication if a lessee fails to perform?
Yeah, I think just to close out the other point, I think the three key words for me in that is clarity, consistency, and expectation setting. And if you do those three things, then you're probably on the right path to having a successful transition and redelivery of the aircraft. But that does start almost at day one.
Agreed. And your point about how you have ultimately in mind transitioning, right, to the next user, right? So everything needs to work that way, consistently.
Exactly. Yep. And then, fairness as well is a key part of it, right? Having that relationship that says what I'm asking you to do and what we're expecting and why we're asking is also fair and reasonable for the period in which you have care and control of our asset.
And it's in everybody's interest, not just the owner, lessor, or financier. It's also in the lessee's interest because it doesn't want to have an asset it's not using sitting on its base while they're pouring out rent on this thing. So it's in everyone's interest to keep this flow and going on to the next part of the life cycle of the asset as quick as possible.
No, exactly, because the key for us is really to be able to seamlessly transition from one operator to another, and when you've got delays and problems in that, that's when it becomes challenging from an asset perspective. So that is the key, really.
Yeah, and then the new lessee is delayed getting its asset because you're having problems sorting out the problems with the outgoing lessee. So it's as you said, it has to be a smooth process, and it goes back to what Kieran said. If you follow those three rules, then you've got a decent chance of it being so.
Yeah, and generally, I think it's been a smooth process. I don't want this to sound negative. I think lease returns in the beginning, it was difficult. People were figuring out what to do. People communicated. There's horror stories all around, but most of them, I think, are successes.
Yeah, and I think, again, we talked about this. I think we've all learned a lot. Lessees have learned, lessors have learned, and as you say, there were some issues. There will always be some issues because that's the way of the world. But the important thing is we're aware that those issues can happen, so we're almost looking for them at the beginning. When that process starts, we know what's happened in the past, so we're like, is that going to happen? If it's going to happen, how are we going to fix it? So they don't come as a shock at the end, and those shocks at the end are the ones that are difficult to work around, and they can cause delays. If you know what's going to happen, you plan accordingly. You get a plan B, you get a plan C, you get a plan D if needs be, so that you can hit your timelines. And it's it's like the swan. Everyone else thinks it's going really smoothly, but you're paddling away and getting those issues resolved.
Well, what lessee conduct makes you nervous? Right?
A lessee is not communicating.
During the course of a lease. Like what lessee conduct, what do you observe,
all of it,
that all of a sudden, makes you start thinking about better call the in-house or better call the asset manager or whomever?
Reporting. They start reporting. They need to. The lessor should receive a monthly report. The report's becoming scarce. Aircraft on the ground for more than expected or more than they should. You need to start asking questions.
Yeah,
living.
I think ultimately, we know lessees have problems. I mean, that's a lessee having a problem is okay if they come and talk to us. They should see the lessor as a valuable partner. We've had situations that lessees said, okay, this has happened, so we don't need this aircraft. And we said, well, okay, but one of our other clients does need an aircraft, and you link them up, and they're both happy then. So having a lessor involved is actually can be a very valuable benefit in relationship and help ease issues. But we don't know that if the communication doesn't come from the lessee. So on both sides, it's very important.
Some of it would be trending as well. So every year we have a look at the assets. We'll have a look and see what's happening with the condition of the asset.
Physical inspection?
Yeah.
Right.
And then, we actually share that with the operator as well. So we'll say, okay, this is where you are today versus where we're all driving to in, 2 or 3 years' time. So if you see a trend there, then that should be a trigger for a conversation around, okay, well, what are we doing to change that trend in order to actually hit the target ultimately?
What if you're very concerned, right? In other words, you're seeing your customer, you read articles in the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal and, bad news about what their prospects are.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to that? What do you do? What do you start thinking about doing anyway?
Well, as I say, you make sure you go and visit them next door. So, beforehand it might have been phone calls and so on, but you go and visit them and you talk to them, and that would sort of be our, sort of one of the key steps, because face-to-face discussions, you need to understand what the issues are and pull out, and there may well be a resolution there, but you don't know.
Yeah, remember, lessors are sophisticated financial institutions. They have proper credit policies and procedures that kick in when something like that happens, and that involves all the departments of the company. That involves legal, that involves the technical team, it involves the credit team. That means that inspections get stepped up. That means you're talking to the PBH providers. You're talking to other people that are dealing with them to get intelligence as to what's happening. And you're increasing the frequency of the credit reviews. In regard to preservation of asset value, that's where Kieran comes in, and he goes with his team and looks at the asset and ensures that how far are we, if we stop the clock today, how much in the hole would we be in vis-a-vis, getting it to the end of the lease.
Oh, good, we get it back, but
right.
We get it back, right?
Yeah, and I can attest to that.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and I think,
go ahead.
I think, I think we're going to get into this about sort of the difference between a planned schedule return and maybe some of the challenge from an unplanned perspective, but really it's not unplanned, it's unprepared. From a team perspective, we spend a lot of time and effort to make sure that we've got the resources, the technical competencies available, build those in-house. And that means that you're never going to be prepared for an unprepared scenario or an unplanned scenario, but as much as possible you can react, and that's the key.
Zohar, if you're representing a lender, how much patience is your client going to have relative to the patience that they might have?
Well, it depends how many assets they've got on the books, if they have the relationship, and it's very case specific. We have this with the fixed wing as well. In the UK in particular, you have the issues of fleet lien on airport charges and navigation charges, which with helicopters would be much smaller, but it's still a risk. And if you have many assets with a particular operator, if you don't terminate early, you can be on the hook to pay all these charges for the entire fleet rather than for one helicopter. So there are a lot of consideration taken into account. And to see, but for a lender, the last thing they want is to actually repossess helicopter because they don't know what to do with it. So they would try to keep it as much as possible with the operator to see what they can do, maybe restructure the debt. In recent years, we've seen lenders go into arrangement with the debtors and converting debt into shares, and all sorts of arrangements, trying to help them keep on going, because that's the best thing for a lender, to have the aircraft continuing to fly. And just one last thing, in the UK, you don't have the Chapter 11s situation. So if you have an insolvency situation, the AOC is suspended immediately. Not only that, the liquidators become personally liable for anything that the company does, so they can't operate. There is no way in which the company can continue to carry on business. And this is subject to review at the moment, but it's going to remain this way for a long time.
But we're going back to the point about, what can a lender do during this period of time? Ultimately, yes, they want to restructure. They don't want the asset. They want to be as far away as they can from it. But to the extent they don't have the in-house capability, to do the things that we talked about a lessor could do, they need to go out and hire an asset manager for the pure purpose of understanding what is the shape of the asset and what's going to happen here and how can I remarket this. So I think being prepared is probably the proper thing, and it's probably never too early to be prepared for that. So whether you have that in-house or you go out and hire a third-party manager to do that, I mean, that's what I would do with my money.
They probably will have had someone helping them. The issue that I see is that, again, they don't have the in-house resources to manage this external resource. So they have the advice, but they don't have anyone who is able to digest that advice in an effective way, and they find themselves exposed. So the lessor community is much better placed to deal with this situation because they've got the resources in-house.
Yeah, and we have the scale as well. So I think Corey mentioned it in his presentation. I mean, somewhere between 50 and 70 assets in our portfolio transition through one shape or form every year. So on average, we're dealing with one transition per week. So you become good at the transition, and a lot of people talk about sort of 80-20 rules. I'm a bit more ambitious than that. I like 95% 5. So if we're executing seamless transitions 95% of the time, and we're throwing our resource and experience and expertise into working with the operator and partner, where there is the 5 problem childs or issues that you've got to work through, and there always will be some of those. I mean, we're not flawlessly executing all the time. So, but if we've got the resource and expertise to be able to work through those, then that's kind of where we end up delivering real value to the whole process.
Let's go to our last, overarching question. What lessons, best practices have we learned that should lead to better results?
I'll maybe start that one, Eddie.
Yeah, sure, right? So, please.
I think what we just mentioned, everyone on the panel's mentioned it, start the process early. The earlier the better. So the more planned you can make it. There are steps in this process that have to be executed. I think the industry has learned a lot over the last sort of 5 or 7 years in this, and some of the operators have just gone through returns of aircraft for the first time or taking transitioning aircraft. So delivering sort of that partnership approach is really, really key. Being clear on the objectives and how we're going to get there. And I think also making sure that the timing of the sequence of events is clear too. So if you do those things, then usually you'll have a good outcome.
So I'm going to ask this question, anybody can answer it. Should the industry develop standard lease return provisions?
I mean, obviously,
You can
Kieran
also
thinks
comment as to whether that's practical, but should it be an aspiration?
I'd say to some degree it has happened.
Yeah.
There's still going to be differences through the specifics of each individual operational lease, and customer, or company. But I think to some degree there has been a convergence on what it takes to actually do this process successfully. So the lessons are being learned and will continue to be, and it'll be refined over time. And you'll find that with any industry, as the people that actually run the process get better and better at it, you'll actually converge at a specific solution.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I think it's probably quite interesting for the lessees who have aircraft with different lessors. They probably force that process a little bit, because the message that we hear from them quite reasonably is that they don't want to have different sets of redelivery conditions processes, because they can't manage that, and we understand that. So,
and they'll tell you that. They'll say, sure,
absolutely.
we can have these different provisions, but no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do what we do across the
fleet. And it goes back to sort of that very thing we said at the beginning. These leases, these deals have to work economically for the lessees, otherwise it makes no sense. We know that the money they earn goes to pay our lease rentals, so everyone has the same interest to make sure that the operators are successful, they pay the lease rentals, and the business burgeons, so everyone's happy. So if they're saying to us, please, we've done deals with Milestone, they have a good redelivery process, they have good redelivery conditions, we look at it, we agree with it, that's fine. I mean, I think everyone in the industry would be happy with that. So I think it's probably a lessee operator driven sort of, and it's probably even happening without us really being aware of it, because ultimately, Kieran's sitting here saying that Milestone have fair leases. I'm sitting here saying LCI has fair leases. So if that is the case, then our conditions are going to sort of overlap, merge. Yeah.
How do you deal with the tension between the customer relationship issues and optimizing value, right? So you have a number of different customers. You have a different relationship with each. Some need more flexibility this way or that way. balancing that against, well, geez, if I change for you for this deal, I have a whole, portfolio of deals with other customers who are going to want the same thing.
I think that is the issue. I mean, ultimately, you have to be there to listen to what the lessee is asking for, and you have to decide whether it's something that can be acceptable, because obviously once you've accepted it once, there's a very good chance that you'll be asked to accept it again. And I think it's a case-by-case basis, depending on what the request is. So, but for sure, you always have to listen, because maybe what they're saying is fair and reasonable and makes sense. And if that helps, then fine. But if we also agree to it, then there's a good chance they'll ask Milestone to agree to it. In fact, so it has to work on an industry basis, I think.
Yeah, I think it's understanding what's important to each of the partners in that agreement, because what we're trying to do essentially is make sure that you've got an asset that you can transition through a 25 or 30-year life successfully and seamlessly. And every time you can't do that, it has an impact on how you've taken a view on that aircraft. And if you're not able to do that, then obviously that has an impact on how you need to think about the asset. So it's really, really important to us that we can do that multiple times through the asset life. And Corey mentioned sort of being able to re-roll or modify easily, and all those things come into it. But also being able to manage the relationship either side of that transition is fundamental to us too. So, but it's important for us then, as the owner, to be able to understand what's important from an operator perspective too. What are the real key points?
And I know, just to pick up on that, and I know we sound like a broken record, but I think the tension gets reduced by starting the relationship by focusing on what's going to happen at the end of the relationship. And as long as people are aware and knowledgeable about what's going to occur and how they're going to achieve those those return objectives, I think that mitigates some of that tension, because there's always commercial.
Yeah, I agree, Todd. I think you've got, one of the lessons learned, for example, is that there's no doubt about it. It does take some time and focus and resources from an operator perspective to do this process successfully. And that's kind of one of the things we've seen sort of develop over the last couple of years, where we're working in a very sort of symbiotic relationship with a lot of the big operators now to develop those standards. So outside of even the contract obligations, how do we work together in order to make sure that we don't get to the end and we've got these problems on our hands?
What about the role of a maintenance program, right, in terms of preserving value, assuring value throughout the term, and then when the term is over, transitioning? What's practical to expect? What's practical to require?
I think there was probably a time in history where those sort of programs, and we're talking about PBH type solutions, that were probably seen as the Charlie's golden ticket. That was how you solve that part of the equation. I think that's sort of open to some debate nowadays as to whether that's the optimal solution. Again, what we're getting from those programs is very different from an operator perspective. You're looking at, the cost availability sort of equation and trying to maximize that. From the asset owner perspective, you're looking at very different things from that agreement. So it's really, again, back to the understanding of what are we both mutually trying to achieve from having that in place.
Yeah, and also you can protect yourself as well. I mean, you will take assignments to the PBH programs on day one. So to the extent there is a problem, we make sure that we have the rights to talk to the OEMs, deal with the OEMs, step in, and that obviously gives us comfort, but also our financiers comfort as well. They want to have the same rights. So, there are built-in protections there as well.
But at the end of the lease term, what is it that you want to have? What do you want to achieve relative to the maintenance program?
No lowest cost possible for a transition. And you can achieve that via PBH, achieve that through MR, you achieve it through how you price the deal. So I think you just have to understand what that cost is going to be at that transition. And there's going to be surprises, because as we discussed earlier, the PBH cost in country X is not necessarily going to be what it's going to, for operator Y and, somewhere else in the world.
In very general, non-lawyerly terms, for mostly lawyers on the panel, how would you generally describe that in the return conditions, right? Well, how would you set yourself up so as to be able to accomplish that? Okay.
Well, the parts that are on the program, they are under ongoing cover. So you need to make sure that all the tasks have been performed, and there is no reason they shouldn't have been performed because they're under program, and that they are current. So all the payments have been made, and that's section. So you need to ensure, and what
But the
think that
transferability of
the
it.
transferability.
Yeah.
And the issue is that these programs are actually very, very complicated, and the terms and the rates that they apply are very country-specific, operation-specific, operator-specific. So whilst you have the reserves in the program that may be transferable to some extent, they may not be transferable like for the next operator, who will have different credit ratings, different operational profile, and will have completely different terms. So it's not a panacea that everybody's thinking of, but it's something that is very good to have for certain.
Well, and I think we might end up generating a difference in the model. Right?
Yeah.
So, if you look at the PBH type structures, they were set up very much to be operator focused on an operator by operator basis, and nowadays that's not who owns the asset, so it may drive to a different solution ultimately.
Okay. Al told me it's time for questions and answers, other than questions from me.
Be gentle.
So, terrific so far. Questions, audience? Ooh, no questions? Oh, question in the back. That's Terry's brother, by the way, so let's see what the question is.
Good afternoon. I just wonder, do you have a metric for how successful returns are today? And of those returns which are late, typically how long are they late by? And the reason I ask that is just because in a year's time, let's say, how do we see that we're improving on our returns?
What would you consider to be successful?
Well, essentially an on-time return, so whatever that specified date is in the lease agreement.
Compliant return.
A compliant return, so that all parties are happy.
I'm a lawyer, I don't have metrics. I don't have the metrics to hand, but I mean, certainly in our experience, we have seen an improvement, continue to see an improvement. There are always isolated cases, as Kieran says, which unfortunately don't quite go to plan, and there might be a coronavirus, for example, which is delaying things. So there can always be something that you can't control that has a knock-on effect. But one thing that we certainly have learnt is to plan ahead, to deal with transitions that, for example, I have a much closer relationship now with freight forwarders than I ever did before, because I know their value, I know how important they are to ensuring smooth transitions. So it's things like that, which we have identified, and speed things up and improve the downtime, because as I said right at the beginning, that's where we lose money and cause problems for our ongoing lessees. So I don't have a metric to hand, but it definitely has improved.
As I said before, I think it's generally been a raging success. I mean, I remember at Waypoint we had a year where there was, I think, 86 returns and release events, and we managed to handle most of them, and most of them were on time and well done. And it all came down to multiple touch points at the operator and the lessor level, proper communication, and just expectation setting.
Yeah, I think I'm not a lawyer, so I do live in the world of metrics. I would think
people like you much more for that.
I think I agree with Terry. I've seen consistent improvement in the delivery of this process over the last 18 months or 2 years. I think we're probably targeting some price close to the numbers I mentioned earlier, that sort of 95% sort of on target execution, and 5% that we're managing through, something of that order. But the key really is continuous improvement cycle, right? So how do we work with our teams every day to make sure that number increases and increases, so that we can do this, without it causing headaches or taking up too much horsepower for everyone's teams.
And we're talking about voluntary returns, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's an involuntary return, then you're rolling the dice.
Right.
Yeah. Any more questions? Any more questions? Yes.
This question for Kieran.
Hi, Jean-Marc.
Hi, Kieran. You've probably seen what happened after the fall of CSG and the return of those machines. I have had the chance to check some of the operation, and I was rather shocked that some helicopters were left outside in condition storage that you and I wouldn't even consider. Storage is one thing. You don't leave an helicopter in a humid environment where you're prone to corrosion. Power check, boroscope inspection. What are the action that you put in place to avoid, to protect your asset, to avoid that is happening on the leasing side?
Well, I think if you kind of take a macro view on that question, Jean-Marc, we've spent a lot of time developing some of the structures that Corey mentioned, sort of, MRO capacity, being able to have partners in that space, being able to develop our ability to store aircraft successfully, being able to develop programs by which you can maintain the aircraft in a stored condition, whether it's sort of flight ready, short term, long term, whatever that may be, developing programs with the engine manufacturers, all of those types of things.
Well, what I meant was, once it's at the lessee, it's out of your sight, how do you make sure that they're going to take care of it?
Oh, yeah, exactly.
It's not out of your sight. If it's out of your sight, you have a problem.
We actively engage with our customers on that basis. So through the whole life of the lease, we have a program now which sort of guides us to the end, essentially.
I think the bigger challenge, though, is, for an operator, you have someone like Kieran on board. For a lender, you don't. So I think that presents an interesting set of challenges, but hopefully you have proper credit agreement in place that provides you with the necessary information that you need in order to ensure that your asset and collateral value is preserved.
Yeah, and actually technology helps in that regard as well. Like our head of technical will be monitoring the actual flights. You don't have to rely on a lessee telling you how it's flying. You'll be monitoring it yourself. You can see on flight radar and so on when they're flying. So if something is happening that you're not expecting it to happen, that's a great way of actually anticipating the problem. So.
Yeah, when someone moves your helicopter to another country and then tells you after
then you have a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Assuming you get the report.
But once the downward spiral starts, it accelerates. And once it accelerates, it's really hard to manage those kinds of
Yeah, you would have to go
circumstances.
into like an enhanced monitoring sort of system at that
Yeah.
point if
Yeah.
required. But that would need to be predicated on some fairly clear indicators.
Yeah,
And
and the
you
whole
could
aim
have,
is
you
to
could have
avoid that.
documents that
Yeah, and when you do, you have, as a lessor, you have a lot of protection in terms of you have a deregistration power of attorney, for example, that you can activate. When things go really wrong, you can step in and become the lessee in terms of accessing the asset, deregistering, talking to the authorities, really taking control over that asset and protect it. So as a lessor, you have it, something that from practical point of view, you need to ensure that these documents are enforceable. So there are certain jurisdictions where they would need to be notarized and apostilled. They need to be validated by a judge. Whatever it is that you do, you need to do it on day one of the lease when everything is, the lessee is still solvent and can pay for all this, and the relationship is good and everything looks rosy. You need to ensure that your security for the rainy day is there available to you, that you can use it in order to protect the asset.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.